We live in a world where there's a lack of discernment, which is why, Dan, we're going to talk about discernment today.
Yeah, you know, to me, discernment is the byproduct of several things. It's byproduct of age sometimes, education, spiritual growth, spiritual maturity. And it's not a specific spiritual gift. Some people say it is, you know, prophecy and so forth.
Yeah.
But I do think it has a lot of spiritual ramifications, because as we navigate a world that is both physical and spiritual, it's intellectual and it's emotional, and those all intersect and overlap at times. Discernment is an important skill that we probably don't spend enough time talking about. That's why I wanted to bring it up.
Yeah, and I'm glad you did, because...
By the way, this topic was suggested to me by a good friend of ours, Clayton Cromwell, who listens to us regularly.
Love Clayton.
And he's very good about giving us important topics that he'd like to hear us discuss.
This might be like the 5th or 6th episode he's probably suggested.
More than anybody, other individual listener, I think Clayton gives us the ideas we use.
And probably Clayton did this because he teaches high schoolers.
Yes. And he's a deeper thinker. That's the other thing.
He is. But, you know, there is something about young people needing discernment, Dan. Like the reality is, the older you get, you should get more discernment because you're wiser. I mean, discernment seems to be kind of a subsection of wisdom. Is that how you would describe it? Or
definitely, but it's also a foundation of wisdom.
Yeah.
Which, to me, is the most important principle of discernment. Discernment is impossible if you do not have a fixed point, if you do not have a foundation, if you do not have an absolute. You know, for instance, how do you tell if a picture is crooked? You can eyeball it, but you may be wrong. It could be the angle that you're standing in the room, or it could just be that your head's off. You know,
so
you've got to have that laser, that straight line, or that level that has the bubble, or you have a plumb line. And interestingly, plumb line also can be translated canon. And can't see C-A-N-O-N, not like the one you shoot. But canon is also what we call scripture.
That's right.
So it's an absolute truth.
So what you're saying is, what discernment does, part of what discernment does is it helps us to evaluate whether something is right or not.
Correct.
Or not right. See, I always used to, the way I view discernment is also like a filter. You know how we have filters on things, you know, we have these little drains and we've got to catch the filter, you know, catches all the food. That I feel like that's a level of a kind of discernment as well, because you not only need the fixed point, but you also need that webbing to say, I'm not going to let this come through. Yeah. Would you say that's a kind of discernment as well?
I hadn't thought of it that way, because it's completely different how I traditionally look at it, but it is also, I would say that's inclusive of it. And to me, it is a metaphysical issue. Okay, so you said it helps us determine what is real, and that is one of the metaphysical questions. What is really real?
Yeah, that's right.
What can we know, and how do we know anything at all?
Yeah.
But so, and that's why I think discernment is such a big deal, because so many in our current generation, and over the generations, but in our current generation, are basing how they respond to feelings rather than facts, to other issues other than what is really real.
Yeah.
Because you can make a lot of decisions, and if you're not basing them on a reality, on an absolute, then all those decisions are potentially wrong.
Absolutely.
So, and our behavior is a reflection of what we believe, and our belief ought to be anchored to something that's belief-worthy, trustworthy.
So, and that's, okay, so I know you have things you want to talk about, but I have...
No, I can go anywhere.
Well, you and I were reading as a staff Strange New World by Carl Trueman. Phenomenal book. I encourage everyone to read it. But in that book, one of the things that here's what, after you read that book, what he does is he talks about all these thinkers and philosophers, you like Nietzsche and Marx and Freud and Reich, that have influenced our world today. And here's the thing that I think why discernment is so lacking, or maybe it's just not a muscle that we exercise that much, because with the advent of technology and social media, with the internet and social media, we now live in a world by which we are getting hundreds, if not thousands, of messages every single day. And what I find is that what's missing is discernment to say, well, wait a second, is what they're saying true? Because we just recorded like 3 episodes on politics, and we don't typically get that political. I mean, we those are kind of like the sprinkles on the top of our episodes. Typically, we do a lot of Bible, theology, practical Christian living. But what I think is happening today is what people have an inherent trust in. If this comes from a right-wing source, if this comes from a left-wing source, I can check my brain at the door and I will accept it as true. And I know we've talked about this ad nauseum, but I remember listening to a newscaster from the BBC who said, she has two online profiles, two conservative, two liberal, and she said within the aftermath of the shooting, she said this is what her feed was filled with, these two different realities. On the liberal side, this was all a hoax perpetrated by Trump so that to get sympathy, to get votes, to get more popular, right? That's all that she's hearing on the left side. On the right side, conservatives, this is a deep state attack against Donald Trump. They're trying to kill him. They're trying to wipe him out. And it's like, those are two different realities. Like, where is the discernment to say, well, wait a second, is that true? But but I think that's with the advent of 1,000 messages, a million miles a minute, and us just blindly trusting sources, this is a muscle we're not exercising today.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad you said this, because it is a problem with conservatives as well as liberals, and atheists as well as Christians. So, Josh, what is the name of that?
It's confirmation bias.
I could not get confirmation.
We are all living in confirmation bias
and
land.
We all have it.
Yep.
If you say you don't have it, you show an incredible lack of personal discernment. Yeah, I have it. Yeah, I know I have it.
But it comes in degrees. Some of us have it less than others, and we should all work on minimizing our confirmation bias.
Yeah, like to me, I know we've talked about Christian movies in the past. If a movie's good, I'm going to say it's good. Yeah. I'm not going to like a movie just because it's a Christian movie. Like, if it's a Christian movie and it's horrible, I'm like, that was a bad movie.
Yeah.
But I think
but then you have the people say, yeah, but you're going to discourage people, and that, they mean well.
I want to encourage people to make good art.
Yeah. But that goes back to the thing that I think we're missing at the core of this, and it's heavy in churches. It was heavy in churches. It's a lack of critical thinking. Yeah. And we don't do a good job of teaching our children. We don't want people to critically think, because that puts us under a microscope. Yeah. So this is, if I gained anything from being an overeducated idiot, it was the process of becoming, earning my doctorate taught me something. And that is the academic process involves putting a thesis out, putting your point out, building the case that supports that thesis, and then printing it, publishing it. That's where they get the idea, publish or perish, and then watch everybody around you, your friends and your enemies,
critique it,
the living tar out of it.
Okay.
And what survives is considered valid.
But that's the way it should be, Dan.
That's the way it should be, but that's not the way it is.
I'm going to go on a rant, because the reality is...
A bin rant. I can't wait.
I'm speaking from my... All right, so going back to school, getting my master's degree, hearing my son getting his bachelor's degree. Now what's happening, I had classes that were very DEI wokeism kind of classes on multiculturalism, and they give you the prompt saying, write a paper on this. And it's like, so I have to, you're making me write a paper that's forcing me to write a paper on this position that I don't even agree with. Now, what I would like for them to do is be like, hey, diversity, equity, inclusion, good, bad, let's talk about it. Like, why not just put the idea out there and let people actually debate the idea? What are the pros? What are the cons? No, instead, for example, my son has to write a paper on the dangers of global warming. Now, global warming is, I don't want to get into opening that can of worms, but the reality is it's a very nuanced science, right? That it's not just one thing, but the whole point is, today's education, what they're trying to do is you are forced to write papers on certain subjects and topics that are predetermined for you. You're not allowed to question. You're not allowed to think differently.
Yep. So that
drives me nuts.
Critical thinking forces us to ask, why is that the way then? We can either accept it and say, hey, that's just the way the game's played, or we can apply critical thinking even to that. For instance, I would ask the question, why are people being pressured to hold a certain position on DEI topics or on global warming or anything? Why do you think that might be? What would be some hypotheses on it?
Well, I think if I'm going to take the position from someone who's for DEI, what they're looking at is, we can point to years or decades of
Not talking about the evidence.
neglect.
What is the motivation?
Oh, what's the motivation?
Yeah.
Well, because their worldview feels like they have been oppressed, and therefore they want justice.
So what is that motivation?
The desire for justice?
Is it really a desire for justice, or is it a desire for power?
Well, okay, so that's an interesting question.
Yeah. So I think
there's some. Go ahead.
In these worlds, and this would be my argument, look for the power and look for the money. Because if you want to succeed in academia, if you want to get tenure, which means they can't fire you, if you want to get the grants that will pay you above your tenured professor pay, and have all this money to do all these dream projects you have, you'd better get in alignment with the people who have the money and who have the power, or you won't get tenure. You won't get the payment. You won't get your material published. And so it corrupts it. It corrupts the process. It was better when preachers and academics and politicians were poor. It really was. And that, by the way, that was the intention. We were never supposed to have a professional legislature in this country.
Yeah, you're right.
We were supposed to be a citizen legislature that you went and did your voting, but then you went back and you earned your living.
Yeah.
And now what has it become? It becomes, the Nancy Pelosi's and the Mitch McConnells who go to Washington as middle class as you and me, and they leave there 40 years later, multi-millionaires, and they're getting paid $140,000 to $180,000 a year.
Yeah,
something's stinking there.
Yeah,
and you have to realize that that's true in academia. It's true in the media, and if we're going to be honest, we're going to be critical thinkers. It's true in faith leadership, because money talks, and people will. If you have the illusion of wealth and success, people are going to follow you because they want wealth and success as well. That's why the prosperity gospel is so malicious all over the world.
What you're saying is people will purposefully check their brains of discernment at the door because of issues of authority.
I don't think they know they're doing it. I think the human being has the amazing ability to believe what it wants to believe.
Oh, yeah, to rationalize what we really want.
Yeah. We all do that.
Yeah. And so that goes back to this critical thinking that the Bible says, search your heart. And what does it say about our hearts? It's desperately wicked. That requires us to be critical. Now, Dan, do you really want this because it'll glorify God? Do you want this because it'll build the kingdom? Or do you want it because you're going to get more speaking invitations?
The fact that you're asking yourself that question, like those are the leaders that we need. You're self-aware enough to be wondering, because we all can have that. We can all have like, am I trying to get more power, or am I actually trying to make the world better? But the fact that you're asking that means probably you're at least on the better half of it.
Well, and I think, Dan, what you just said is probably one of the most foundational points that you're making here is the first discernment you have to do is against yourself.
Yeah.
You have to discern your own heart and mind. If you want to discern others, I mean, like the fixed point obviously is God's word, God's truth, but it's like you've got to check your own motivations. What you're saying is, why do I want to do this? And there's an honesty that's involved of saying, is this really genuinely because I love Jesus, or is this simply for me?
Yeah.
I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, and you've really hit on it. Both of you did on that. And if I would say the number one need that someone has to have if they're going to have discernment is to be a critical thinker. Number 2 and 3 real closely are you have to develop self-awareness, and you also have to cultivate personal mindfulness. So when I am not mindful of my own proclivities, my own capability of being an idol erecting factory, manufacturing factory. Oh, if I'm not mindful of my core inclination to prefer myself above all else, then I'm going to get into this habit, this routine, that says, hey, this feels good, or this end justifies the means, or all kinds of false philosophy. But here's the reality. In a TikTok generation where the average information exchange is 20 seconds or less, and the average attention span is less than 60 seconds, there is no self-reflection. There is no mindfulness. There is no self-awareness, because we are living from dopamine hit to dopamine hit.
Yeah. I think so it's interesting you bring that up, that this idea of self-awareness, mindfulness. I listened to a podcast on Dwight Eisenhower's planning of the D-Day. And just, it was really interesting how probably one of the greatest leaders our nation's ever had in the history of our nation, Dwight Eisenhower. I didn't know this. He grew up in a household where his parents were kind of like Jehovah's Witnesses. They were called Bible students or something. It was before that, but they believed the world was going to end in 1915. And he kind of rejected all of that, went to the West Point. He really became fascinated with war after reading a biography on Hannibal. But the whole point was, he said that formative years with these almost like cultish doctrine, dogma, like the world's going to end in 1915. That's what they believed. He said he was, for the rest of his life, he was always, what did it say? If someone was very sure of themselves or just said, this is definitely what's going to happen, he would always question them. He's like, he didn't like anyone that was like so dogmatic
the same way.
Of like, this is there's almost over the top confidence. He's like, something's not right there.
And it's the smarter you are, the less you think you know. The less confident you are.
That's true. But I think what you're saying is, if you're not aware of, he was so aware of his experience and human nature that he was not going to be duped again. That's what I think was happening. And that's what I think someone from discernment is going to look and say, the mindfulness of themselves and of human nature and the people around them, to be like, what discernment does, I think, Dan, it helps people move slower.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's go slower here. Yes. Like we don't have to rush into anything. We don't have to. And so, anyways,
like the fact that your friend was like, there's media on either side. If the media on either side last week was telling you that this was an inside job on either direction, that's a bad source. It was neither. The good sources were all saying, let's pause.
Yes.
Let's wait.
Let's do an
72
investigation.
hours
Take
at
a breath.
least and like just mourn together as a country and then figure out what's going on and then have our debates about gun control and Secret Service and like all that stuff. But like, let's wait.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that exactly, actually, I have it written down, practice patience, because I think, and now I'm going to sound like an old dude, but one of the benefits of aging and surviving life is you get to the perspective where you don't feel in such a huge rush to reach conclusions. I don't have to be the first one to post on something. I don't have to be the first one to form my opinion. Well, that was not the case for a lot, and you knew me in those days. And I thought it, I said it. I'd sort through the fallout later. But again, the Bible indicates that there is a growing wisdom with age, and I couldn't appreciate that until this point. And it also requires those of us who may be aged or aging to be patient with those who are impulsive. The young men dream dreams, So, but I do think it's really, really important in our modern culture to see how we have built I was going to say system, but it is a culture. We built a culture that diminishes it diminishes reflection. It diminishes patience. It diminishes everything's exploding rapidly. Knowledge, AI. And one of the most dangerous things about AI is how quickly it is coming to pass, and we're not taking the time to ask, should we do what we can do?
Yeah.
And ultimately, there are ramifications for that, and they're usually not positive ones.
Well, yeah, because when technology, discernment, the foundation of should we do this, as opposed to when should we do this. Right. That, to me, is what is missing today.
Ian Malcolm is the classic discernment guy here, right? Your scientists are so preoccupied with whether or not they didn't stop to think if they should.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
That's
exactly.
The thing.
If you have questions, hey, we love to hear from you. LifeTalks@lifecharlotte.com. Send in your questions, your ideas, thoughts about episodes that you love to hear from us. Thanks again for listening to this episode of Life Talks. We'll talk to you next time.